Dread Hunger is full of passionate players, myself included, and there are a bunch of complicated, controversial topics that regularly leave these players profusely arguing with one another over in-game voice chat for us all to hear. In this series, Dread Hunger Tough Topics, I'll be breaking down and laying out the arguments for each side of the selected issue before reaching my own conclusion, along with a solution for you all to use should the problem pop up in your own games. To ensure that all the information I've presented is accurate, I've reached out to a handful of experienced players to weigh in by answering some questions and providing their thoughts on the topic in a sort of interview style. These answers have shaped the arguments presented in this video and should ensure that all viewpoints are represented fairly in all future Dread Hunger Tough Topic videos. The goal of this series is to gather the very relevant information to help us understand the logic behind the common arguments on each side of these tough topics. I'll then need to cut through any of the flaws or bullshit arguments that might be present, before carving a solution to create the best possible Dread Hunger games moving forward. Now, in order for these videos to be of any use, I do need to ask you, the viewer, to leave your own opinions on each topic at the metaphorical door and follow along with how I break apart the issue with genuine intent to listen and understand all arguments presented. I hope to lay a clear path of logic for you all to follow and dissect the issue to find the source of the problem before building my solution from there. With all of that said, let's leave that bias behind and get into it. Today's tough topic is poison and antidote balance. Basically, is poison and antidote in a good spot right now? Now, this topic isn't going to be nearly as controversial as my last tough topic video covering muskets in the armory, but I think it's very important to gather all the information we can on the topic of poison and start a discussion about its place in Dread Hunger moving forward. It's a good sign that people aren't complaining about poison being overpowered or banning poison's use in their lobbies, but in many lobbies, particularly meta-heavy games, if anyone who isn't the doctor or chaplain, and I guess sometimes marine I hear, loots a doctor bag, they'll be heavily sussed and possibly killed. If players are being sussed simply for looting a particular type of resource, there's probably a problem. Okay, let's get into the arguments. One argument is that poison is in a pretty good spot right now, arguably the best it's ever been. Poison is an option that's used by a good number of thralls, primarily characters with easy access to poisonable goods like the cook and the doctor. It does have varying results from ineffective to deadly, but that's controlled by the crew's preparation. It could be argued that a crewmate who heavily prepares antidotes has wasted their time when poison isn't used, giving the thralls an edge. But of course, this preparation isn't guaranteed and depends heavily on the luck of laudanum spawns. Some games you'll be decimated by a doctor who gets 5 poison syringes by day 1, and no one made antidotes. Other games, the thrall will be lucky to find 1 laudanum and crewmates will have managed 5 antidotes between them. Poison does its job. Once ingested, the poison will take some time to take effect, but when it does, it will do significant damage to the player that has ingested it. So at the very least, poison can be used to give you a PvP edge. As it stands, poison will kill a player exactly 1 minute and 50 seconds after it first takes effect. It's lethal, but gives time to frantically search around for an antidote in a significantly weakened state. Poison is easy to make, requiring just 3 herbs to make, and can be found in lock boxes as well for rare access. It can be ingested by eating stew or other consumables, or injected through a syringe. There's multiple ways that you could be poisoned as a crewmate, so it can be difficult to pinpoint the exact source if timed correctly. For casual players, there's plenty of opportunity to poison the other players, as the crew are more likely to turn their back to you or neglect a stew in a casual game of Dread Hunger. At least in comparison to competitive lobbies where you'll be lucky to ever see an exposed back or an unprotected stew to poison. Doppelganger's introduction was also a big buff to poison, giving a solid method of administering poison without being directly linked to the poisoning. It might not be perfect, but there's a strong argument for the idea that poison is in a good place right now, especially for casual games, and creates interesting matches. Poison capitalizes on player mistakes and isn't a priority to be tampered with right now. But this isn't the only viewpoint on this topic. Many believe that poison could be better, and in its current state, poison is too conditional and unreliable. It's difficult to source discreetly and even more difficult to administer to the crew without being noticed. What do they mean by this? Well, let's break it down. For starters, poison's effectiveness varies significantly depending on your role, the map, and who your opponents are. For example, a doctor will be expected to make antidotes and has first claim to the doctor bags. If the doctor is a crewmate, he'll prepare an unpredictable amount of antidotes on day one and be ready to counter any poison play you're able to organize on the first day. Alternatively, if the doctor's the Thrall, he'll neglect antidotes and return to the ship with an unpredictable amount of poison syringes. These are complete opposite results, with a hugely different impact on the game. Either everyone gets poisoned with limited antidotes to save them, or the Thrall's day one plan is completely shut down by antidotes, and they'll likely be banished from the ship. The other method of distributing poison is through food and drink, or consumables. These again have the same extremes, with the cook either locking themselves in the kitchen and protecting the stew with his life, or poisoning the stew themselves and being a little careless on its protection for an alibi. There's the strong crewmate defense for poison stew of one player testing a stew, or forcing the cook to eat their own stew first, and there's not a whole lot the Thrall can do to counterplay and get around this. Players are just hyper cautious around food and drink and dread hunger in general though. The armory's introduction sealed up the back entrance to the stove from being accessed before the armory is opened, which is honestly a great shame. This little gap in the wall gave Thralls another way to impact the stew being made by a crewmate and gave poison more avenues of reaching the crew without it resulting in the Thralls outing. But possibly the most frustrating part of poison's current state is its source. Herbs can only be sourced from doctor bags, with one occasional herb showing up in the stove when you first open it, but that's honestly fucking useless. This simple fact gives the crew a very simple way to monitor poison's creation. Who is looting the doctor bags on day one? As lobbies can get competitive, you'll see many crewmates, myself included, commenting and sussing any player who we've deemed should not be looting doctor bags, particularly early on into the game. It's a fascinating problem. Who should be looting doctor bags? You can't leave them exclusively to the doctor, as if he's a Thrall, the whole crew will just die to poison. You can't just leave them to doctor and chaplain, because if they're both Thrall, you all die to poison. But if anyone else touches a doctor bag, you expand the list of suspects if a poison play does happen, and also increase the chance the Thrall has managed to source poison. If you see a cook loot a doctor bag on day one, you're immediately going to assume that they're going to poison the stew, not that they're going to make antidotes and stew simultaneously. When you also consider that the cook can create antidotes faster than anyone else in the stove, why shouldn't he also be trusted with doctor bags as a third source of antidotes? It's a complicated problem. With so many different expectations, you end up with irrational killings, mass poisoning, or just insanely one-sided crewmate victories. The doctor bag distribution on each map will impact which of these three results will occur. On the approach, doctor bags are severely lacking. You'll be most likely to pull off a deadly poison play here, with minimal crew antidotes to save the game. The Expanse's doctor bags are distributed more fairly, with only 8 doctor bags being in the first half of the map. But 6 of these are easily pathed between down the left-hand side of the map, so one player can accumulate a lot of poison, and could potentially decimate the whole crew if done so successfully. Finally, the Summit's doctor bags are plentiful and relatively simple to monitor early on into the game. The crew will have a lot of antidote sources and will most reliably be able to counter any poison play you make on day 1. Poisoning the crew can be devastating if it leads to a complete crew decimation, but it could prove to waste very little of the crew's time if they die on the ship and immediately let out and are able to reclaim their items. It's basically just a soft reset and uses up the crew's extra life resource, but will not stall the crew out for longer than the 1 minute and 50 seconds it takes to die to poison before being released. A competent crew will stick together after they've died, and it'll be very difficult to capitalize and take out any of these crewmates who have died once already to dwindle the crew's numbers. As it stands, antidotes and keys completely top poison. Players are extremely cautious around food, and experienced players will rarely leave their back exposed to someone that they don't trust. So who's right? And what's the solution? Well, I can see value in both arguments. For a casual game, poison as it stands is fine how it is. You won't encounter many of the problems that were argued in the against arguments, as simply put, players are more casual and will likely make more mistakes, and thralls won't have such a difficult time gathering or distributing poison without getting caught. But if we're talking about true balance, where the tools available to the thrall ultimately achieve what they need to do, that being to stall the crew out long enough to prevent their escape, then poison isn't reliably achieving what it needs to right now. Crewmates aren't being stalled out much longer than a tier 3 whiteout, and it takes a lot of the thrall's time to prepare and distribute poison, and that's not even considering the risk of being caught doing so. We need to address each of the problems discussed so far and provide a solution that would work for both casual and more competitive players. Problem number 1. Doctor bags can only be opened by the doctor and maybe the chaplain in competitive lobbies. Anyone else who takes them will be sus for doing so and likely have to prove they brewed an antidote afterwards. Solution: redistribution of doctor bags to make them easier to loot in private, or the creation of a new lootable crate of some kind that also includes herbs. Basically, herbs need to be more accessible and more difficult to track who gets them. I would also suggest decreasing how many herbs spawn in each doctor bag, so there are no greater amount of herbs on the map when this is introduced than there currently are. The herbs would just take more time to gather. Problem number 2. Stew is too easily protected, and any poison stew should only ever be blamable on the player who made it if they're playing properly. My solution? Create a new crack in the wall along the staircase at the front of the ship next to the armory. This would allow a player to access the stove through the wall from the staircase to poison stew that's being made, and force the cook to remain in the stove for the whole duration the stew is being created. This change alone will give the cook plausible deniability if a stew does get poisoned, and gives thralls more access and avenues to poison the crew. Problem number 3. When the crew die to poison, they can be immediately released and reclaim their items. My solution? Dying to poison needs to take longer. This will result in a greater amount of time wasted before each crewmate dies. The poisoned player needs to keep their body near the cells so they can loot it once released, so the player will be unproductive until the poison kills them, right? With poison taking more time to kill, being easier to distribute, and being easier to source without being sussed, I expect we'll see an increase in effective poison plays, with a good balance between the risk of looting and distributing the poison, and the amount of time to source and create an antidote for the crew. Finally, I'd also suggest decreasing the amount of antidotes a player can carry in one stack, to prevent one player from being like the king of antidotes with 10 antidotes while still being able to carry coal and be productive in other ways for the crew. Antidotes need to be more of a burden to carry to discourage hoarding antidotes and balance out who's carrying them. Thank you all very much for tuning in to this Tough Topics video, and special thanks to all of those who sent in their thoughts on poison's current state in the game. Your answers have sparked me to reconsider my own stance on the problem and heavily shaped this video. Before I go, please like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more Dread Hunger videos. Good luck out in the Arctic. and watch out for Bongo.